I guess I should start my story from when I was a child. I think I was around 5 or 6 when my parents decided to rent a holiday caravan on the south coast near Weymouth. From then on, every school break, we'd head down there. Usually it was just my mom, my two sisters, and me, because Dad couldn't always join us due to work. After a couple of years, Dad upgraded to a bigger caravan, and we started inviting friends and relatives to join us for breaks away from the city. There were many other families from different parts of the country with caravans on the site. When Mom took us down without Dad's car, my sisters and I would explore the site and the local area. Having a family car in the 1950s was a luxury. Not everyone had one back then. Unfortunately, Mom never got the hang of driving, although she did scare a couple of driving instructors before giving up on it. There were always other kids around to play with on the site. My sisters thought they were too old to play with little boys. My best friend down there was Harry. Harry was a year older than me, but we hit it off the first time we met. She had a big red birthmark on the left side of her face, and I never understood why other kids avoided her because of it. The birthmark didn't bother me, and since Harry was a tomboy, we became good friends during our time in Weymouth. If Harry's family didn't go to Weymouth for a school break, I found it boring there. Harry was an only child, and we felt more like siblings than just friends. My two older sisters were stuck up when they were young. As we grew older, climbing cliffs and throwing stones into the sea lost its appeal. We explored every corner for miles around over the years, even finding spots to spy on couples making out. It was amusing when we were 10, trying to figure out what they were doing. But as we got older, we felt awkward sneaking around like that. We didn't talk about it, but being close friends, we could sense each other's feelings. By then, Harry and I were considered old enough to take the bus into Weymouth on our own, exploring the town and harbor. Sometimes ignorant people would say hurtful things about Harry's face, and I ended up in fights defending her. I knew it hurt Harry when people made comments about her appearance. Around age 12, Harry started wearing makeup to cover her birthmark. Honestly, I thought it made her look worse, but I never said anything. We started going to dances at the club on the caravan site, where we had been many times over the years. They had kids' activities in the morning, and as the day progressed, there were dances for younger kids in the afternoon, older ones in the early evening, and adults later on. But Harry and I were now dancing with the older kids. The bouncers knew us well from before. If anyone ever said something about Harry's birthmark, the bouncers intervened before I could even react. They saw I wouldn't tolerate anyone upsetting Harry. When I was 15, Harry disappeared during Easter. My whole family went to Weymouth before Good Friday. I went straight to Harry's caravan, but it was still closed for the winter. The site office told me the caravan had been sold. The rest of that holiday was the worst I'd ever had. Every day, my mom and dad took me out. Later, my dad tried to find out what happened to Harry and her family. Years later, he told me Harry's father had passed of influenza that winter. Her mother couldn't afford to keep the caravan, so she sold it. Dad hoped to find Harry's address so I could write to her, but he couldn't. Harry and I were friends in Weymouth, but we never thought to exchange addresses and keep in touch. All I knew was she lived somewhere near Bath. After Harry left, Weymouth lost its charm for me. That summer, while my mom and sisters went to Weymouth, I stayed home with my dad during his summer break from work. The rest of the summer, I hung out with my school friends. The next year, my mom decided it was time for us to join the latest trend, going abroad for our summer vacation. My sisters, who were dating boys by then, probably influenced her, as they didn't want to be away from their boyfriends for so long each year. The caravan was sold, and we set off as a family for a couple of weeks in the sun. Interestingly, we traveled by train, which took 24 hours. I went along with them for the first few trips to Rimini in Italy. But when I turned 18, I wanted to hang out with my friends, so I stopped going with them. Pop festivals were all the rage then, and that's where my buddies and I went whenever we could. It was the 60s, and we had a blast for a few years. After finishing college, I tried out various jobs but couldn't stick with any of them. By then, I owned a 1959 Hillman Minx, my own private getaway car. One day, my boss said something I didn't like. I can't remember what. And I told him to shove his job, which I hated anyway, and walked out. Not long after, while stopped at a red light, my Hillman got rear-ended by a truck. I got out, and the truck driver apologized profusely. I can't recall the exact conversation, but it ended with me following him to his nearby yard, where his boss promised to cover the cost of a new rear bumper and have it installed. The next day, I took my car to the transport yard to get the new bumper fitted. While waiting in the reception office, a guy unexpectedly told me to follow him. Like a fool, I did. I never asked why, but he led me to a truck's driver's seat, where he showed me the controls and explained the gearbox. Then he said, "Out the gate and turn left," and I started the engine and did as he said. I drove the truck for about 30 minutes before returning to the yard. I parked the truck and he told me, "You're good. If you ask me, you've got a knack for this." Then he walked back toward the office and I followed him. As we entered, the boss I met the day before came out of his inner office and asked the guy, "Mitch, didn't I tell you to take that guy for a driving assessment?" "I did. He'll be fine." "How did you manage that when he's still sitting here in my office?" "Well, since I was out of work, I ended up getting the job while the other guy didn't." The next Monday, I hit the road as a truck driver. I have to admit, I really enjoyed it. At first, I didn't know much about the job, but I had a great sense of direction. Back then, drivers looked out for each other, and I learned a lot about loading trucks properly and securing the load from many of them who helped me out. Being on the road suited my personality. It was the first job I truly liked and settled into. I soon found out that several companies specifically requested me when they needed a truck delivered. My boss liked that because it showed I was doing well and keeping his customers satisfied. At Marshall's, one of the places where I often picked up loads, there was a girl named Thelma working in the dispatch office. Thelma was stunning in every way. She dressed to catch the eye of the guys and enjoyed the attention. Her short skirts and tight blouses highlighted her beautiful figure, and her high heels accentuated her legs perfectly. I thought Thelma liked to flirt when I first started going to Marshall's. I'm confident around women, but I'm not the type to ogle at a nice pair of legs or a shapely rear end. While other guys chased after Thelma, I kept things strictly professional whenever I dealt with her, which was every time I called because she handled dispatch. Over time, I found myself going to Marshall's more and more almost exclusively, along with a couple of our other drivers. I have to admit, I enjoyed working there. It felt like a big happy family compared to most companies. We had free reign of the place while waiting for our loads and could access the canteen whenever we wanted. Old Man Marshall prided himself on knowing everyone in his workforce of around 200 by name. Before long, he knew my name and the names of the other two drivers from our company who worked there regularly. In early December, I pulled into our yard on a Friday night to refuel and pick up my wages. When I walked into the office, Mr. Wilkins, my boss, came out and asked, "So what are your plans for tomorrow then?" It wasn't the first time he'd asked me this. Usually it meant he had a driving job for me on Saturday. "Not much planned." "What's going on, boss?" I replied. "Do you have a decent suit, lad? We're invited to Marshall's Christmas party. He invites us every year, and if we don't all show up, he gets upset." "Sounds good to me, boss. I clean up nicely when I have to." "All right. I'll meet you here at the yard at 6:30. George and Jack are riding together, but I've got plenty of room in my car for you. You can come with me and the wife." I wondered why George and Jack weren't riding with the boss and his wife in his big Jaguar, which easily seats 5. But I didn't ask anything. The next afternoon, I felt a bit awkward in my suit since I hadn't worn one since hitting the road. I hopped into my boss's car for the ride to Marshall's factory where the big party was going down in their huge canteen. Mr. Wilson insisted I call him Bill for the night. But I knew come Monday it'd be back to boss as usual. He introduced me to his lovely wife, and I couldn't help but wonder how he managed to snag such a babe. I figured it was probably money, but that's not really important here. When we got to Marshall's, George and Jack showed up with their wives, and it dawned on me why they hadn't ridden with us. I did wonder why no one mentioned I could bring a guest, not that I had anyone in mind. If wives were invited, girlfriends should have been too. I chalked it up to Bill Wilkins forgetting. Mr. and Mrs. Wilkins sat at the main table with Old Man Marshall, his wife, and all the big shots from the other companies who worked with him. The 5 of us wandered around trying to find our assigned seats. I was a bit uneasy when we found seats for Jack, George, and their wives, but couldn't spot mine nearby. I wandered around a bit, starting to think I'd been left out. Honestly, if I couldn't find my seat, I planned to sneak outside and hide until after dinner. But then Thelma tapped me on the shoulder and led me to my seat, right next to hers. Come on, I'm not dumb. Thelma was sitting where my guest would have been if I'd known I could bring one, and that meant I was sitting where her guest should have been. I had a feeling I'd been set up somehow. Old Man Marshall was making his rounds as everyone settled in and found their seats. When he approached me, he thanked me for coming and praised my work. Then he said, "Well, my boy, our lovely Thelma here didn't have a date for tonight. Mind looking after her?" I assured him I would, but I couldn't help wondering why Thelma, who was so lovely, didn't have someone to accompany her. That night, we were served by caterers since all the canteen staff were attending. Some of them were at our table, closely watching everything the caterers did. After dinner, we endured a series of long speeches. The tables were cleared to make room for a band that played music suitable for everyone from 16-year-olds to 60-year-olds. Thelma and I danced together, but a couple of guys asked her to dance as well. By about 10:30, I'd had a bit more of the free drinks than I probably should have. While dancing a slow song with Thelma, which was a bit arousing, I asked her why she hadn't found a date for the evening. Thelma giggled, clearly having had a few drinks herself. "Don't be silly. I could have found plenty of guys who would have loved to come, but I wanted to spend the evening with you." Why? Do you really want to know? I wouldn't ask if I didn't. Well, because you intrigue me. Ooh, I intrigue you, huh? And why's that? Well, you're different. You don't chase after me like the other guys do. I'm curious why. Don't you find me attractive, or are you, into men or something? Thelma, no, I'm definitely not gay, and I think you're a very attractive young woman. Oh, so you have a girlfriend? No, actually, I don't right now. Why haven't you ever asked me out before? I hope I haven't said anything to offend you, Thelma asked. Quite the opposite, Thelma. You're a nice young lady, as I mentioned. But you're what, 18 or 19? I inquired. 19, Thelma confirmed. I'm 24, and I'm on the road 5 days a week, often away overnight. I'm looking for a steady relationship. Please don't take this personally. I need someone who's okay with quiet Fridays and won't be out with other guys when I'm away. So I've had a date with you tonight, but I don't think you're ready to settle down yet. You enjoy it when guys chase after you, I explained. Oh, is that it? Yes, afraid so. Are you upset? A little disappointed, maybe. Can I at least get you under the mistletoe tonight? Sure thing, girl. It would be my pleasure. After that, I sensed Thelma was trying to prove something. Every time we danced, we ended up under the mistletoe. Around 1 in the morning, George told me Mr. Wilkins was ready to leave. I kissed Thelma goodnight as we walked to the car. As it pulled out, I saw another guy put his arm around her. The next week, I was on a different job and missed going to Marshall's. They closed for Christmas the week after. But then my boss convinced me to work right after Boxing Day up in Aberdeen, delivering urgent research gear for the new North Sea oil exploration. The weather was terrible, and I spent nearly 2 weeks waiting on the harbor for the ship to arrive and unload the gear. I had a blast in the pubs up there. There's no better place to spend New Year's Eve than Scotland, even if it's stormy, pouring rain, and freezing cold. But by the time the ship I was waiting for finally showed up, the novelty had worn off. It had been hiding from the storm at another port along the coast, and no one thought to let me know. Typical, right? Just a humble truck driver. Who cares about me? When I got back down south, I took a couple of days off to make up for being away over New Year's. The boss didn't love the idea, but he knew I'd walk if I got upset. There were plenty of driving jobs around for someone who knew the ropes back then. On Wednesday morning, I pulled into Marshall's loading bay bright and early. I walked into the dispatch office and got the shock of my life. Sitting in Thelma's chair was a woman I hardly recognized, dressed in a baggy sweater and slacks, her hair tied back. She jumped up when she saw me, wrapping her arms around my neck and kissing me like there was no tomorrow. "Good Lord, Thelma, are you trying to suffocate me?" I joked when she finally let go. "I missed you. So do I pass the inspection now?" she asked eagerly. "Thelma, I don't know what to say. Tell me, do I still look like some flirt who hops around with different guys every night?" "I never said that," I protested. "Maybe not, but you implied it." "So, do I measure up as your girl now?" "Well, of course you do. You always have, but..." "Great. So I'll be waiting for you to pick me up on Friday night. Here's my address and your delivery notes for the rest of the week. Oh, and I've sorted things so you can finish early on Friday. Now get to work. You've got a lot on for today and tomorrow." All right, what could I possibly do or say that wouldn't upset her? So, like going along with it, I kissed her and headed back out to the loading bays to load my truck. Friday evening, I showed up at her place around 7 o'clock to pick her up. She came out carrying an overnight bag. What's the bag for, Thelma?" I asked nervously. "Well, I thought you wanted to go to your local pub. It's got to be at least 35 miles from here. I figured I could stay over at your place if you're up for it. That way, you won't have to drive back and forth all weekend," she suggested. So Thelma stayed over at my parents' house that weekend. Not in my bed, but in my sister's. They were both married and gone by then. Thelma slept in their old room. The next weekend, I stayed at her parents' place, and we checked out pubs around where she lived. Her parents were cool. I hit it off with her dad and younger brother. Her mom seemed a bit hesitant at first, but she warmed up eventually. Yeah, you guessed it. Thelma had me wrapped around her finger from that first weekend. From then on, she dressed conservatively at work and elsewhere, at least as far as I knew. But when we went out together, she dressed to the nines. I soon found out Thelma wasn't innocent, not that I thought she was. But I also learned she couldn't take birth control pills. They didn't agree with her, so we didn't have closeness often, and when we did, we made sure to use protection. 3 months later, we were engaged, and before I knew it, we had made a down payment on a rundown old house located almost exactly halfway between our parents' homes. We spent nearly every spare moment over the next year renovating the place, bringing it up to modern standards. Once the house was done, the next logical step was getting married, which we promptly did. The reception was held in Marshall's canteen, with the canteen staff handling the catering. Old man Marshall was there and congratulated us warmly, expressing his pleasure at seeing us together. How much he was involved in Thelma's plan to win me over remains unclear to this day. Maybe Thelma just used his goodwill, something I later realized she did with many people. Life was wonderful in the following years. Thelma got pregnant shortly after our marriage. Sure, we used protections most of the time, but hey, we were newlyweds, and sometimes things got a bit wild. You know how it is. After having our first child, Tracy, we decided to have our second, Helen, as soon as possible. 2 kids felt like the right number for us, and Thelma took care of the birth control issue permanently. She had some complications during Helen's pregnancy, so the doctors closely monitored her from early on. While Thelma was pregnant with Tracy, I got a call from old man Marshall. Long story short, his transport manager was retiring, and with Thelma on maternity leave, he was in a bind. He had already spoken to Bill Wilkins and asked if I would step in as the transport manager until Thelma returned to work. It made sense for me because I could be nearby when Thelma gave birth instead of traveling all over for work. Reluctantly, I agreed. The only hitch was that when Thelma and I decided on our second child, my temporary position at Marshall's became permanent. The job wasn't tough. It just required knowing vehicles and planning truck routes. Over time, I grew to somewhat enjoy it. It wasn't as thrilling as being on the road, but the pay was better and there were no extra hours. I was actually glad I could spend time with our 2 little girls. I was pretty sure they'd grow up to be just as charming as their mom, though I knew there might be challenges ahead. I figured I'd deal with those when the time came. Life carried on like it does for most couples with young kids. I genuinely felt like I had everything: a good job, a nice home, a loving wife, and 2 wonderful daughters. But sometimes things take a turn unexpectedly. If I had to pinpoint it, I'd say my first hint that something wasn't right came when Tracy turned 6. One morning on my way to work, I noticed the car behind me. Now I get it. Roads are public, cars follow each other. But what caught my attention was the car behind me. Being a truck driver for years, you develop a keen sense of awareness on the road. When you're hauling valuable cargo, that car behind you could be up to something. Or worse, it could be an unmarked police car, a real hassle when you're on a tight schedule. So, if you're smart, you keep an eye on the cars behind you. Every driver should, really. I'm talking about not just the car, but its occupants. Trust me, you can spot them a mile away if you're paying attention. No, the car I had noticed behind me stayed there consistently. At junctions, if he fell behind, he quickly overtook everything until he was right back on my tail. He definitely wasn't a cop. They drive much better than this guy, but it was clear he was following me. That evening, as I left work, I noticed a different car in my rearview mirror, and it was clear the driver, a woman, was following me all the way to my house. The next day, the usual guy was tailing me again, and by evening, the same woman from the previous day tracked me to the local pub. On Thursday nights, I make it a point to unwind a bit. I grab a single drink, always mindful of the drive back, and play some snooker with a few colleagues. It wasn't long before I spotted her entering the pub, soon followed by the man who had been following me earlier. They seemed to coordinate their arrival, but acted independently once inside, each heading to the bar to get a drink without acknowledging the other. As the evening progressed, the situation grew oddly unsettling. Here I was, focused on a casual game of snooker, and there she was, seated at the bar, making a show of herself and staring in my direction with an intensity that felt almost tangible. Every now and then, our eyes would meet across the room, and she'd flash me a smile, as if to engage me further. Despite the attention, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was some sort of setup. I was baffled about who might be orchestrating it and why. Falling for whatever they were planning was out of the question. I wasn't about to be anyone's fool, nor was I interested in any part of their apparent scheme. I had a suspicion about the possible motive behind this. Old man Marshall, the head of the company where I worked, treated his business like a large family unit and held family values in high regard. I was somewhat of an outsider, having entered the company scene by marrying one of Marshall's favorite employees, and quickly became one of his favored ones as well. There were whispers around the office that I was fast-tracking to more significant positions within the company. It seemed likely that someone might be envious or view me as a rival, perhaps trying to concoct a scandal that could jeopardize my marriage and diminish Marshall's high regard for me. Determined not to give away my apprehensions, I ordered another drink as a cover to mask my real plan. After pretending to take a sip, I casually made my way to the restroom. From there, I slipped out through the back door, evading their notice. My goal was to flip the situation on them, to catch them off guard by disappearing, but the uncertainty of not knowing exactly who was orchestrating this made me cautious. I drove straight home, left to wonder how long they might have sat there waiting for me to reappear, clueless that I had already made my escape. The next morning, the guy was back, but I shook him off easily. Leaving Marshall's that evening, the woman started following me again. I led her on a detour ending in an industrial area I knew well, then parked and sneaked up behind her car unseen. I surprised her by appearing suddenly at her car door. Realizing I had caught on, she hastily reversed and sped away with an impressive maneuver. I cursed myself for letting her escape, then headed home, hoping that was the end of it. They seemed to have stopped following me once I became aware of them. But 2 weeks later, a different woman was at the bar when I arrived on Thursday night. She made a comment as I got my drink, but initially, I didn't connect her to the others. It was only when she joined me at the jukebox that I realized what was going on. "Get lost, lady, and tell your friends I'm not stupid," I told her. "And let that idiot in the Granada know that if I see him again, there'll be trouble." The woman was completely taken by surprise. She looked shocked and left the pub right away. I had noticed the Ford Granada in the parking lot when I arrived, but I hadn't seen who was driving it. About a month later, Thelma tripped in those darn high heels she insisted on wearing and ended up breaking a bone in her ankle. I got a frantic call from her while she was at the hospital, asking me to pick up the girls. When I got there, the doctor said the break wasn't serious, but needed to be put in a cast. However, her ankle was swollen, so they had to wait for the swelling to go down before they could apply the cast. Thelma had to stay in the hospital until then. I had to take a couple of days off to take care of the girls since it was summer break. It was a change for me to play both mom and dad. They had a blast making fun of me, especially when it came to cooking. I'm not great at it. Getting everything to finish cooking at the same time was tough. That evening, while I was juggling things in the kitchen, the phone rang. Since my hands were full, I asked Tracy to answer it. At 6 years old, I figured she could handle it. We had taught her what to say. "Oh, sorry, Uncle Frank. Mommy's in the hospital. She hurt her leg." "Daddy's taking care of us." "Bye-bye." Tracy hung up. "Who was that, Tracy?" I asked. "Oh, just Uncle Frank," she replied. There was just one problem with that answer as far as I was concerned. Who the heck was Uncle Frank? I'd never heard of him before. I was about to ask more questions when I heard Helen calling Tracy from the other room, and Tracy ran off to see what she wanted. Curious, I followed Tracy, but for some reason I didn't enter the playroom. "You're going to be in trouble with Mommy. You broke your promise to Mommy that you'd never tell Daddy about Uncle Frank." What did I just hear my daughter say? I thought. Then Tracy replied in a typical kid's manner, "I didn't tell Daddy about Uncle Frank." Then came the usual back and forth of, "Yes, you did," and "No, I didn't." I decided not to get involved in their argument. It seemed both girls knew I wasn't supposed to know about this Uncle Frank, and jumping into their conversation-turned-argument would put them on guard. I thought it best to let it go and wait until they were more relaxed. But I was troubled for sure. I couldn't understand why Thelma would keep some guy a secret from me. Unless, well, I didn't want to go there. Denial, I guess, kept me from thinking that way. Thelma's ankle didn't get better overnight, as the doctor had hoped. To me, it looked even more swollen than the day before. When the nurse told me it might take a week to improve, I realized I needed some help at home before the girls got sick or started showing signs of malnutrition from refusing my cooking. My sister offered to stay over and help with the girls, which allowed me to spend some time at the office. Sarah brought her 9-year-old daughter, Marcy, along. I can't say I was too fond of Marcy. She seemed to take after her mother, who, even though she was my sister, wasn't someone I particularly liked when we were younger. We had gotten along better now that we were older. I'm not sure why I did it. Maybe I needed someone to talk to, so I told Sarah about this Uncle Frank. Perhaps my girls were sworn to keep the secret from me, but Thelma might not have imposed the same restriction on others. When I shared with Sarah, she sat quietly for a moment. Then she spoke. Do you think Thelma? I'm not sure what to think, Sarah, but I don't like my family keeping things from me. Is that why you disliked Ginny and me when we were young? We never let on to you about anything. Maybe, but I won't tolerate my wife keeping secrets from me, especially about other men. I don't blame you. Thelma is a beautiful woman. I never understood how you won her over. Well, Sarah, it wasn't me who won Thelma over. She pursued me. She had good taste, I'll give her that. So, what's the plan? Do you want me to talk to the girls about this, Frank? I thought they might open up to you. I heard Helen mention that Mom made them promise not to tell me about him. They might feel they're not breaking her trust if they talk to you. Leave it to me. I'll see what I can find out. But I'll be subtle so I don't make them suspicious. Thanks, sis. Just try not to make a big deal out of it and make them wary. The next morning, I left Sarah with the kids and headed to work. In the afternoon, I visited Thelma at the hospital, and she mentioned Sarah had spent about an hour with the girls earlier that day. I don't know why I did it, but I asked Thelma if there was anything she needed to tell me. She seemed puzzled. All she mentioned were some unpaid bills and things to do at home. Later that night, after Sarah had put the kids to bed, she sat me down at the kitchen table and gave me a serious look. I don't know who this Frank guy is, but you need to figure out what's going on. So you spoke to the girls about him? What did they say? Don't be silly. I had Marcel investigate. I figured the girls wouldn't recognize her as an adult, and you know how kids can be. Anyway, about this guy Frank. Apparently, Thelma used to chat with him outside the school while waiting for the girls to finish. According to the girls, he's divorced and his kids go to their school. They say it's his only chance to see them since he doesn't live with his wife. They claim she has custody and makes it tough for him to visit, so he watches them in the school playground. But why keep this from me? Marcy isn't dumb. She asked that too. The story from the girls is that Frank's wife works at your company, and Thelma worries you might tell her he's watching their kids at school. Oh, I get it now. I guess that explains it. But surely Thelma doesn't think I'd rat the guy out to his wife? Nonsense. That story doesn't make sense at all. Think about it. If Frank was at the school when the kids were let out, wouldn't his supposed ex-wife see him? And when I sent Marcy back with more questions, it got even more concerning. Your girls have no clue who Frank's kids are. It's a small school. That just doesn't add up. And on top of that, sometimes when Thelma takes the girls to the park playground after school, Frank is there too. And what really caps it off, he's been with them at the park during school breaks and even treated the kids to ice cream, candy, and burgers. Little bro, you've got a serious issue here and we need to figure it out fast. Maybe Thelma planned to meet Frank the day she fell. That could explain why he called her that day to ask why she didn't show. Do you think they're having an affair then? How would I know what to think? But I'll say this, something fishy is definitely going on, and we need to uncover the truth. I'm glad you're in this with me because I'm starting to feel confused. Well, let's not jump to conclusions. There might be a simple explanation we're missing, but honestly, I doubt it. Now think hard, brother. Can you remember anything significant Thelma has said or done recently? Anything unusual? Well, Thelma hasn't done anything strange, but something odd happened last week. I explained to Sarah about being followed and the strange behavior of the two women trying to flirt with me in the pub. Sarah couldn't make sense of it either. The following day unfolded much like the previous one. Thelma's ankle was improving, and the nurses assured me she'd likely be home by the weekend. That night, after putting the kids to bed again, Sarah, who had seemed anxious since I arrived, couldn't wait to talk privately. What color was the car that followed you? She asked as soon as we were alone in the kitchen. It was a maroon Ford Granada. Why? Close enough. The girls described it as dark red. I think it was this Frank who followed you. And I have some troubling news. Marcy thinks the girls have been inside that car. They described the interior to her in detail, how spacious it was and how soft the seats felt. They also mentioned the child locks, which means they must have been inside the car to notice. I agree. Look, I called in a favor today and contacted Bill Wilkins. He has connections in the police, and he's trying to get information on the owners of those cars that followed me. Good move, bro. Marcy deserves credit for getting so much out of the girls. Yeah, I owe her big time for all her questioning. I'm not sure if I should take that as a compliment, Sarah replied with a smile. Friday morning, Bill Wilkins called my office early. He said the Granada belonged to a guy named Frank Williams, well known to the police. The other two cars were rented from a budget rental company. Interestingly, one of them hadn't been returned, and the renter, a man, used fake documents for both vehicles. That afternoon, after making some calls, I went to the hospital to pick up Thelma. Before Thelma knew I was there, I had a chat with the nurse I'd been coordinating with all week. After a little prodding, she mentioned that a man had been visiting Thelma every afternoon after I left. She found it odd because he never brought anything with him for Thelma. Most people bring something, even if it's just a get-well card. No, I didn't think our Frank Williams would leave any evidence I could poke into. Guys like Frank Williams are pretty slick when they're on the prowl. But if he thought he could get away with what I suspected he was planning, he had another thing coming. That evening, when we got home, Thelma was surprised the kids weren't there to greet us at the door. As she hobbled in on her crutches, she asked where they were. I sent them to my folks for a few days. I thought it would give you time to rest, I said. Oh, that wasn't necessary, Thelma replied, settling herself on the sofa in the lounge. I would have preferred them here. But I think it was necessary, Thelma. We have a lot to sort out in the next couple of days. I don't want the girls getting upset. What things? Thelma asked, as Sarah came into the room with a tray of tea and coffee. Oh, Sarah, you're still here. You didn't need to stay. I'm sure I can manage with the children. I can stand on my ankle now that it's in plaster. I'm not here for you, Thelma. I'm here for my brother, Sarah said sharply. Thelma's face suddenly lost color and she looked at me. What's all this about? Well, that's the question I was going to ask you, Thelma. What's going on between you and that creep, Frank Williams? Thelma glanced at me, then at Sarah, and back at me. It seemed like she was at a loss for words for a moment. Then she made up her mind. Well, I guess you found out, haven't you? I suppose it had to happen eventually. I'm sorry, but I've fallen in love with someone else. I didn't want to tell you yet, but I'm going to divorce you and marry Frank. Just like that? I questioned. Yes, I've been trying to figure out how to tell you for weeks now. I didn't want to hurt you more than I had to. Sarah started to say something, but movement behind her caught her attention, and she paused. That's all I needed to hear. I can get things started now. I'll be in touch, a voice said from the hallway. Then we heard the front door close. I glanced at Sarah and turned back to Thelma. Very considerate of you if it's not a lie. Did you get Frankie Boy to try to set me up? What was the plan? I get seduced by one of his friends and boom, you divorce me? You probably thought I'd have to pay you alimony, right? What a great wife I used to have. Tough luck, baby. I didn't fall into your trap. I'll give you credit. The idea was clever. You wanted to leave me with my good job while you live with an unemployed guy and you expected me to support you in your new life. I have no idea what you're talking about. What setup? Well, if you don't know, ask your weird boyfriend. Here's how it's going to be. You have the weekend to get your stuff out of my house. My lawyer is preparing the divorce papers ready for you to sign on Monday. You can't do that. You should be the one leaving the house. I need it for the children. Oh no, sweetheart. You and your weird boyfriend aren't getting near my children. You can visit them, but only with a social worker or me present. The social services will get that order before a judge tonight. What are you talking about? They can't do that. Oh, but they can, sweetheart. I've always thought social workers were a pain, but once they found out you were planning to move in with Frank Williams and had been exposing our kids to him, they've been very helpful. You won't be allowed near them anymore, and I think the police will want to talk to you, too. I don't get it. Why would the police want to talk to me? Oh, you foolish woman, Sarah interrupted, determined to speak her mind, so I let her continue. What did you think Williams was doing hanging around outside that school? The man is a child offender with a rap sheet a mile long. He wasn't after you, you silly girl. He wanted your daughters. Thelma's expression was unforgettable. She looked at both of us in disbelief. You're lying. Frank wouldn't do that. Oh, really? Where do you think he's been for the last 7 years? He's been working overseas, in the Far East, I believe. More like on the Isle of Wight. Parkhurst Prison's there. You could stretch to call that overseas. Anyway, when the police finish talking to him and my kids, we'll find out if he's harmed them already. But I'm warning you, if that man hurt my kids, I might just end both of you. Sarah had to call an ambulance then because Thelma suddenly passed out, and we couldn't wake her up again. Her father or brother must have picked her up from the hospital because I certainly didn't. I didn't see her again until the day we finalized our divorce paperwork. Thelma realized there was no use asking for custody of the children since social services still had an order against her, stating she had endangered the girls. It came out that Thelma had left the kids in William's care multiple times while she went to the hairdresser and such. But the specialists who interviewed my daughters assured me nothing had happened. They believed Williams was still in the grooming stage, being careful not to scare them off by moving too quickly. Williams hadn't committed any crime that the police could prove. They suspected he stole the rental car but hadn't used it as intended when things fell apart. Curious, I asked why they thought Williams took the car. The police inspector glanced at me and said, "Well, you've been lucky, sir, even if it's been rough. The last woman Williams manipulated into his life to offense her kids was a widow. Her husband passed in an unsolved hit and run. We can't prove what Williams intended with the car, but we can guess. If he sticks around, we'll keep a close watch on him." "Not too close, I hope," I replied. The officer checked around to ensure no one else could hear. "Don't worry too much, sir. As long as no one gets hurt, our officers can be quite patient." "Of course, I never said that, and make sure you have a solid alibi. Some people think Williams and his kind are just mentally ill and deserve sympathy. Personally, I think a harsher punishment would be too kind. He's a sly, evil guy. And sir, try not to blame your wife too much. Williams is skilled at manipulating people. If you'd seen him in that interview room, you'd think he was harmless. She never had a chance once he set his sights on her. It wasn't until we showed her Williams's file that she truly understood what kind of pervert he was. Looking back, I realize I might have been fortunate to survive. Williams was clearly preparing for all possibilities, but knowing what that jerk intended for my family, I decided I wouldn't ignore it. However, I could wait until things calmed down before taking action. Over the next couple of years, everything remained uncertain. Thelma wasn't allowed to see the children without supervision, which was frustrating for both them and her because she couldn't take them out anywhere. Based on what the police told me and what Thelma herself said, it seems she didn't have a chance against Williams. I believe she wouldn't have tolerated him harming our daughters if she had known. I have to believe that for my own peace of mind. About a year after the initial separation, I approached social services to discuss easing the visitation terms for Thelma with our children, and they consented. Since the kids were never in foster care, the decision ultimately rested with me. Thelma hinted a few times that she hoped we could get back together, but I shut down those conversations quickly. It was clear to me, especially after chatting with some neighbors, that there was more going on than met the eye. They had seen Frank Williams' car parked at her place often during the times the kids were at school. I doubted the innocence of those visits. This wasn't a scenario out of a wholesome storybook. I suggested Thelma might be better off finding someone new to start over with, which she eventually did. He seemed like a decent man, albeit somewhat stubborn. I heard he even proposed to her, but she turned him down, insisting she needed to come clean about her past first. According to what I gathered, once she told him her full story, he walked away without a word. A dramatic turn of events followed 2 weeks later, when Thelma ran over Williams with her car right outside the local police station. She had seen him loitering near another school and promptly called the police. They took him in for questioning. When they released him, Thelma was waiting. As he walked along the sidewalk, she hit him with her car. The aftermath was chaotic. Thelma drove to the river where she allegedly tried to drown herself. I'm not entirely sure drowning was her real intention, though. Thelma has always had a knack for creating dramatic scenes, and I heard a police car was not far behind her during this episode. Initially, Thelma faced manslaughter charges, but they were dropped due to concerns about her mental stability. It was decided she wasn't fit to stand trial. She spent a short time in the local psychiatric hospital, where they concluded she wasn't a threat to others and released her about a month later. Her only requirement was to attend regular therapy sessions every couple of weeks. However, social services decided to impose stricter conditions on her future visits with the children, likely due to the severity and nature of her recent actions. That's how things turned out. Sarah's husband, Ralph, started working on oil rigs in the North Sea. So Sarah and her family basically moved in with me to help take care of the girls and manage Thelma's visits with them. Though the gaps between her visits were getting longer, and it felt like I hadn't spoken to her in years. I think it was just before Helen's 10th birthday. Sarah, Ralph, and I were sitting in the kitchen one evening, reminiscing about our childhood times. Naturally, we talked about Sarah's and my summers in Weymouth. Ralph suggested that we all go there for 2 weeks that summer. Sarah loved the idea, and before Ralph and I realized it, she had invited Ginny and her family to join us too. We rented 3 caravans next to each other at the same site where our family used to stay when we were kids. The children had a great time on the beach, and they enjoyed it when we showed them all the places where we used to play. We even ran into a few locals we knew from our childhood. One morning, I took my 2 girls for a walk along the cliffs. The cliffs had changed a lot due to erosion by the sea. It took me some time to find the tree where Harry and I used to carve our initials every year, Some of them were still quite visible. H&H, 1959, Tracy said. I wonder who they were and where they are now. Well, one of them is standing right beside you, I replied. You're kidding, Dad, Tracy exclaimed. Then who was H? Oh, she was just a friend. What do you mean? Was she your childhood sweetheart, Dad? Helen asked eagerly. I wasn't prepared for what I was getting into. Well, in a way she was. I spent many happy holidays down here with her when I was your age. But I'm not sure if you could really call her my sweetheart. I only kissed her once. Was it nice? I wasn't sure if Tracy was trying to tease me or genuinely curious. Yes, it was very nice. I would have liked to kiss her more, but she didn't come back the next year. Oh, that's sad. Were you really upset? Yes, I was. But if you don't mind, let's change the subject. The change of topic was welcome, but for the rest of our vacation, my daughters, Sarah and Ginny, kept bringing up Harry in one way or another. Anytime we visited a spot around town, they would eagerly ask if Harry and I had been there together. Before I could even attempt to deflect with a vague, I don't remember, Sarah and Ginny would jump in with vivid confirmations. They seemed to delight in tracing our shared past, so much so that even the cakes and treats they prepared bore the initials H and H, subtly etched into the icing. I tried to feign annoyance at their antics, but their laughter was infectious, and soon enough, I found myself laughing along with them, swept up in the nostalgia and the light-hearted mood they created. Upon our return home, the embarrassment did not cease. My sisters, Tracy and Helen, spurred on perhaps by the fun we'd had reminiscing, encouraged my parents to pull out all the old holiday photos featuring Harry and me. As we flipped through the dusty albums, my daughters scrutinized each image with keen interest. I was particularly apprehensive about how they would react to seeing Harry's noticeable birthmark, which was quite prominent in many of the photos. Remarkably, though, the topic never arose. Whether Sarah and Ginny had been prepped by their aunts to avoid the subject, or they simply chose to focus on other details, I was relieved it didn't become a point of discussion. The following year, we made another trip to Weymouth, this time without the extended family. Just my daughters, Sarah, Marcy, and me. Ralph was initially supposed to join us, but he canceled last minute due to unforeseen work obligations. Surprisingly, Sarah took the news of his absence in stride, even though Ralph's job on the rigs often kept him away for extended periods. We crammed into my car for the drive down, with the trunk and roof rack fully loaded with our luggage. The first couple of days in Weymouth passed in a relaxed, enjoyable blur, but then, on Tuesday morning over breakfast, my girls suddenly expressed a desire to revisit the tree with our carved initials. The excitement was palpable as we set off around 10 in the morning. The three girls were unusually lively, singing and dancing along the path as if they were part of a musical. It was clear they were up to something, but their cheerful spirits were too contagious to dampen with questions. When we finally arrived at the old tree, Tracy dashed ahead of the group. She reached the tree first and triumphantly exclaimed, "Yes, yes, he's done it! He's done it!" Then the three girls gathered around the tree. When Sarah and I approached, the girls stepped back. Beneath the carving from 1959 was another one that read H&H 1982. I stared at it for a moment, trying to grasp what was happening. Suddenly, Ralph emerged from nearby bushes with a couple of children I didn't recognize. "She says you'll know where to find her. She told me to tell you she's where you used to spy on the courting couples from. She'd like to meet you in private." Without saying anything to Ralph, I took off jogging toward our old hiding spot. But when I arrived, Harry wasn't there. Disappointed and confused, I turned back. Not long after, Harry jumped out and startled me, a game we used to play as kids. "Christ, Harry, you scared the hell out of me," was all I could manage. "Well, it's payback for all the times you've startled me," he joked. We reminisced and talked like we did when we were children. When we returned to the tree, everyone else had left. Slowly, I shared bits of my life story with Harry as we made our way back to the caravan. Harry told me that after her father passed away, her mother couldn't afford to keep the caravan and had sold it. She mentioned feeling just as upset as I did about us not meeting again. Over time, her mother remarried a very nice man who, during Harry's teenage years, paid a lot of money to have her birthmark removed using early laser technology. It wasn't completely successful, but greatly boosted her confidence. Then she said something that surprised me. She shared that meeting me as a child was the only other thing that boosted her self-esteem as much as the birthmark removal. She recalled that I was the only child who never commented on or asked about her birthmark. Harry went on to tell me that she married a soldier and had two wonderful children with him. Sadly, he passed in a training accident in 1978. Since then, she had been living with her stepfather, as her mother had passed away from a stroke some years earlier. Ralph somehow tracked her down with help from friends on his oil rig who lived near Bath. They found her weeks before our holiday, but they kept it a secret from me until that morning. Sarah said she thought Helen and Tracy might accidentally spill the beans a couple of times. Harry and her children stayed with us in the caravan for the rest of our holiday. No, Harry and I didn't immediately start a romantic relationship. We had a special friendship as kids, and now we're getting to know each other as adults. There's something between us, but we're taking it slow to see what happens. Could there be romance? I'm not sure, but I hope so. And I think my children do too. The signs are promising. Everyone, including Harry's children, tried to give us space in Weymouth so Harry and I could spend time together. At the end of the vacation, Ralph and Sarah took Tracy and Helen back home with them, while I drove Harry and her two children home to Bath. Life moves forward. April 2006. After lots of traveling back and forth on the M4 motorway in the following 6 months, Harry and her two children, Russell and Claire, moved in with the girls and me. We had a bit of an awkward situation shortly after they moved in, when Helen and Tracy started calling Harry Mom and decided to call their actual mother, Thelma. Harry and I tried to discourage them by Harry not responding when Tracy and Helen called her Mom. But it didn't work because Russell and Claire, Harry's children, joined in and repeated whatever Helen and Tracy said. When Harry answered them, she was also responding to Helen or Tracy. It took some time to adjust, and Thelma was far from pleased. I'm not sure what discussions took place between Thelma and the girls, but eventually she accepted things as the girls wanted them. Harry hinted that the girls threatened to cut ties with Thelma if she objected. I was sometimes surprised by the hostility the girls felt toward Thelma, which seemed to intensify as they grew older. Then one day, Harry explained that my daughters weren't naive. As they matured, they understood what had nearly happened to them and why the social workers and police had asked them all those seemingly silly questions. Harry and I eventually got married. It wasn't rushed. We had a simple ceremony in Bermuda, of all places. It was a unique choice. We had local witnesses and kept our plans quiet. It was surprising how long Harry wore the extra ring before anyone noticed. Over the years, Thelma's mental health declined, partly due to her troubled relationships. When Tracy married her stepbrother Russell, Thelma was just coherent enough to attend proudly. She looked better than she had in years, escorted by her proud father. Sadly, her father passed away a few months later, and shortly after, Thelma was involuntarily hospitalized by her brother. Now she spends much of her time in and out of a private clinic, which her brother and I find quite costly. But I feel responsible for the well-being of my children's mother. Harry and I are incredibly happy together. Now that all the children are grown and moved out, we spend most of the year at our cottage near Weymouth. We enjoy walking the paths we walked as children, sometimes with our grandchildren tagging along. Life moves on.